Greetings, everyone. Well, today we take a look at yet another adaptation of Frankenstein, this time the Hallmark miniseries from 2004, starring Alec Newman as Victor Frankenstein and Luke Goss as a very pained, very emotional version of the creature. This was actually recommended to me by some of you guys when I was doing my Frankenstein reviews last year, and boy, I can't thank you enough. This is really good, and I think actually one of the most faithful adaptations from the book that I've ever seen. They really did a fantastic job of it. So let's talk about it today on the Halloween Horror Reviews on the Multimedia Chronicles. Welcome back. Yeah, so as I mentioned in the intro there, this is actually quite a faithful adaptation of the original story. Overall, there's a few minor changes, there always are. But it seems to borrow elements from both the 1818 and 1831 versions of the story, mostly 1831, but a few nods to the 1818. For example, Elizabeth. In this one, she is an orphan who is taken in by the family, and they just call her his cousin, but she's not actually his real cousin. In the 1818 version, she was just straight up his cousin. Which is interesting because a lot of the different adaptations don't seem to touch on that aspect of it at all. They just have Elizabeth as his fiancée. Done. So one of the early catalysts for Victor's obsession with reanimating the dead is the family dog is killed brutally, horribly, and heartbreakingly by getting run over by a carriage. And that's when Victor begins to think, like, oh, if only there was some way I could, bring things back to life, who could beat death. And I was quite happy to see one of the big catalysts that sort of serves to fuel and ignite his obsession is there's a raging thunderstorm one night, and he runs out into the rain and sees the lightning bolt hit the tree. And that's when he realizes there is incredible power in nature. And what if that power could be harnessed to create life? Which, of course, is one of the big nods to the 1818 version, because in the 1818 version, that was the central fuel for his obsession, was the power of nature and harnessing that power. In the 1831 version, it was more of a scientific pursuit. I mean, that's in both versions, but there was more of a romanticized aspect of it in the 1818 version that was kind of surgically removed from the 1831 version because it was deemed to be too effeminate of a reason. Yeah, times were different back then. Anyway, much like in the book, Henry Clerval is Victor's best friend, and when Victor goes off to university in Ingolstadt to pursue his scientific studies, Henry goes with him. Now, I should mention, one of the big things I was really overjoyed to see is it opens with Robert Walton and the ship stuck in the ice, and they see Victor pursuing the monster across the ice. The monster takes off, Victor's bobsled crashes, they take Victor in, Victor's dying, and tells Robert Walton his story. So we actually go back and forth quite a lot between Victor telling Walton the story on the ship as he's on his deathbed and seeing the actual story unfold. And I've always maintained that that is a very important part of the book that sadly gets omitted in almost every single version, because the whole reason we're reading the story in the first place, according to the story, is because Robert Walton wrote it down as Victor was telling it. And the whole reason in the book there isn't a lot of explanation as to the actual process that Victor went through to bring the monster to life is because he specifically requested that Walton not write those parts down, because he didn't want anybody else following in his footsteps. So it's a big important part of the story and why the story exists according to the story. So it was quite nice to see that actually in this version. And might I add, Robert Walton in this is played by Donald Sutherland, an always compelling and fascinating and wonderful actor, and he really gave a lot of passion to that role. Victor is played by Alec Newman, who is a young actor that I really like a lot. He was first brought to my attention a few years earlier when he starred as Paul Atreides, Muad'Dib, in the Sci-Fi Channel miniseries adaptation of Dune. Professor Waldman, who is one of Victor's primary mentors at the university, is played by William Hurt, who coincidentally was also in that Dune miniseries a couple years earlier. One thing that's interesting in this is we actually see some of Victor's early attempts to reanimate dead tissue. His first attempt is he gets a dead frog and uses electricity to try to bring it back to life. And it comes back to life, and it croaks at him, but then it dies again shortly thereafter. He talks to Professor Waldman about his experiments, and Waldman is like, oh, it's probably just a reflex action. He's like, no, it was clearly alive, and then it died. Maybe I just need a bigger charge. And Waldman is beginning to sense that Victor's ambitions may be a little too big in this area, and is sort of cautioning him about the path that he's setting himself on. So a little later on, in a wonderful callback to the scene from earlier, he sees a dog in the street get run over by a cart. So he picks up the dog and brings it back to his lab, makes a bigger tub to fit the dog in, and once again tries his reanimation experiment, this time with a bigger charge. And the dog comes back to life. It actually stands up and it looks at him, and it is clearly alive. This is not a reflex action. There is no doubt whatsoever that it is a success. Now the dog stays alive a little bit longer, but then eventually sits back down and then passes away again. But Victor knows at this point that he's on to something. So this was a really important addition to the story, I think, because it showed a progression where he's starting with animals and fairly small experiments, having some success there, and then ultimately deciding, okay, well, the ultimate fruition of this has to be to bring a man to life. So he does the obligatory robbing of the fresh graves, trying to get fresh body parts that he can use to assemble a body that he can then bring to life. He actually tries to get Waldman to help him, but Waldman refuses. And this was kind of interesting to me because Waldman is all about science through and through, yet kept saying that this is against God, this is against nature. So it's kind of an interesting little snapshot of time there where science and religion were still kind of bedfellows in a way. Nowadays, while there are, Christian scientists and so forth, there seems to be a much clearer divide. So with or without Waldman's help, he's determined to follow through on the experiment. So he finishes assembling the body, waits for a nice big thunderstorm to provide tons of electricity, and brings it to life. Now, of course, at first he thinks the experiment has failed because there's no signs of life. So there's, I forget exactly what it was. There's some kind of accident and he gets knocked unconscious. So he's laid out on the floor, and then he wakes up to see the monster standing over him and reaching towards him. And he wakes up and his vision clears and he realizes it's the monster. It's worked. It's alive. And just like in the book, in that moment, the horrifying realization of what he has done kicks in. And he just freaks out. He immediately rejects the monster, pushes it away from him. The monster kind of stumbles back, and Victor leaves. He runs out of the apartment. So the monster's left there all dazed and confused. I mean, it's literally been alive for a few minutes. This is the only other human being he's ever seen, and this human being immediately rejected him. Well, so being stark naked, needing some kind of covering, he grabs the first jacket he sees and stumbles out the door into the street. Elizabeth and Henry show up. Victor meets up with them. They want to go upstairs. He goes off ahead of them. Doesn't see any sign of the monster. And just like in the book, he's relieved. He's relieved that the monster is gone. He doesn't care what happened to it. He's just glad that it's gone. It's no longer his problem. And that's that. So he succumbs to pneumonia for a little bit because he's been overworking himself. And while he's recovering, we follow the adventures of the monster as he goes off into the world for the first time. So at first, the monster kind of stumbles into a village. He's got a big stick that he's using as a walking stick to help him walk. He's still pretty unsteady on his feet. And he's looking for food. He's hungry. He smells food coming from a cottage. He goes in and sees like some food laid out on a table. There's some soup and some bread. So he just starts eating and eating. And then the woman in the house sees him and screams and chases him off with the broom. And then the villagers all join in. It's like, who are you? Get out of here. Blah, blah, blah. It's not that they're so much rejecting him because he looks hideous. Because while he does look somewhat monstrous. The look of the monster in this is very much out of the description in the book, where he looks essentially like a normal man, just slightly deformed, and has long black hair, and he's very tall and broad in stature. So the villagers are chasing him out of town, essentially, but this part always kind of cracks me up, because the monster is hobbling along and he's still struggling just to walk. And so the villagers are kind of angrily sauntering casually after him with torches and pitchforks. But it seemed to me like it was meant to be just kind of a little nod to the obligatory mob of angry villagers chasing the monster out of town or what have you. So they chase him out of town, and he goes off into the forest, and then they just leave him be. So already we have the monster has been rejected by everybody that he's seen. And I gotta say, like, right off the bat, the performance of Luke Goss as the monster is so good. He's so pained and confused and hurt and just full of despair and longing, and just a wonderful, nuanced performance. You see all the struggles on his face as he's trying to cope with all the different situations that he finds himself in, and it's just wonderful. I gotta give mad props to Luke Goss for his performance as the monster. He was just fantastic in this. So, of course, he ultimately finds his way to the cottage, and we have the cottagers, one of the big central parts of the book. Now, this one plays out very similarly to how it plays out in the book. The old man is blind. Felix and Agatha live there, with one difference. In the original book, Felix and Agatha are brother and sister, and the monster kind of listens in from the shed as Felix and Agatha are teaching Felix's fiancée, the foreign girl, to speak English and such. In this one, however, Felix and Agatha are husband and wife, and they have a little girl. They have a daughter. And it's as the daughter is learning English and everything primarily from Agatha that the monster listens in, and he also learns. At one point he goes into the cottage and he's just kind of looking over the books. And one of the books he pulls off the shelf is Paradise Lost. Now, Paradise Lost is referred to a lot in the original book of Frankenstein as well. So it was nice to see that little nod and that connection. And I think metaphorically and symbolically, it's a relevant connection, because he sees himself as the first of his kind, essentially, and where Paradise Lost is the story of Adam and Eve being kicked out of Eden, he essentially sees himself as Adam being kicked out of society. Just as Adam and Eve were rejected by their creator, he was rejected by his creator. There's a lot of parallels that you can draw between the two. So one other way the cottager's scene plays out a little differently is, rather than introducing himself to the blind old man, the monster chooses to introduce himself to the little girl. And the little girl is actually very kind to him and very accepting. I mean, even though the fact that he looks a little strange, she's very friendly to him and doesn't think twice about it. The innocence of childhood, right? So she brings him back to the cottage and introduces him to the blind old man. And the blind old man invites him in and says, why don't you sit and have some food? And then he starts playing some music, and the monster starts crying. And they stop, and he's like, well, why are you crying? And he's just says it's like, just nobody's ever been so kind to me before. And it's just heartbreaking, because it's true. Everybody he's ever met, literally in his entire life, has rejected him or chased him out of town or just otherwise pushed him away, not even given him a second's notice. And here's this little girl and this kind, blind old man who are being so nice to him and have just welcomed him in warmly. And he's so grateful. And that, to me, was like a wonderful snapshot of what the monster's life could have been like if we humans weren't the real monsters and kept rejecting him, And it's just heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking. So one of the things that he was doing, much like in the book, is he was sort of secretly helping the cottagers. So, for example, Felix was having a lot of trouble just kind of making a living for everybody and finding time to chop wood for the fire and stuff. So the monster helped by chopping a bunch of wood overnight and stacking it up by the house. So they kind of saw it as this mysterious guardian angel of the forest who was helping them and just leaving wood there. So they started leaving food out for him, not knowing who it was, not knowing anything about it. So they started leaving food out for him and such, and he was just so taken in by their kindness. And ultimately, over the course of time, that was the catalyst for when he decided, well, I've learned to speak, I've learned to reason and read. I think it's time I introduce myself to them and say, hey, I'm the one who's been helping you. Thank you so much for your kindness and everything. So that's the moment that we're in here with the little girl and the old man. So they're being very nice to him, and it's everything that he could have hoped it to be. It's just such a wonderful moment. And then Felix and Agatha come home, and they see him, and they're horrified. And who is this dirty, grungy, deformed person in here? And immediately respond to him with hostility, but Felix in particular. And the monster's just like, but this is not the way you are. You're a kind man. And he's just like, have you been watching us? It's like, no, you don't understand. He tries to explain it. He's like, you don't understand. I'm the one who I chopped all the wood for you. He's like, get out. And they just won't even listen. They're just completely disgusted by him and chase him out, essentially. So the rest of it actually plays out almost beat for beat like it does with the book. He finds Victor's journal in the jacket that he took at the beginning, and that's how he knows what he is, who Victor is, and so forth. So he tracks down Victor. He encounters William and learns that William is Victor's brother. And much like in some of the other versions I've talked about, William is calling out. He's trying to quiet him because he wants to meet with Victor on his own terms, and accidentally kills William. And then there's the whole sequence where he sees Justine Moritz, who was looking after William, and she's trying to find him. She doesn't know where he's gone. She ends up falling asleep in a barn. The monster finds her and takes her locket and plants the locket on William's body. So then Justine, of course, gets blamed for the murder of William and hanged. And it's just, it all plays out much like it does in the book. So ultimately, he does encounter Victor and tells him about his troubles and so forth, and says that, if you make me a mate, we will go. We'll go away. We'll go off into the mountains somewhere, and you'll never see us again. So Victor complies. And it's around this time that Henry shows up and finds his way into the lab and finally realizes what Victor's been doing. Victor fills him in on the whole story, and Henry cautions him and says, how can you bring another evil into the world, another ungodly creation? I mean, God forbid they should kill more people, or even worse, have children. So Victor constructs the body of the mate, and the monster shows up just as he's preparing to bring her to life. And the monster is just instantly in love with her. He says, oh, she's so beautiful. Like, you've done an amazing job. And he starts talking to the lifeless body of the female monster. He's like, oh, there's so many things I want to show you and experience with you. And then, and then later our children can experience all these wonderful things. And Victor, hearing that, is horrified. And the words of Henry just kind of echo in his head. And much like in the book, he destroys the female before he can even bring it to life. So, of course, the monster swears vengeance and says, how can you condemn me to this loneliness and this misery and just being rejected by this world? Like, how can you do this? You created me, you owe me, and you've gone back on your word. So, of course, he makes the promise, says, you broke your promise to me, so I promise you this, I will be with you on your wedding night. And sure enough, Victor and Elizabeth get married. The monster shows up, kills Elizabeth out of pure vengeance to bring about the same kind of misery for Victor that he has been forced to endure himself. And this leads inevitably to their final chase off into the Arctic wilderness. The monster's like leaving food for Victor and clues as to where he's going so he can follow him. He's leading him very specifically out into the Arctic tundra. And finally, it comes in much where we began, with them on dog sleds, with Victor chasing the monster through the ice. And then, of course, we come to Walton's ship, and that brings us up to the present. So after telling his story to Walton, Victor passes away. Walton covers him up and goes up to the deck and tells the crew that they're going to turn around and head home. Now, this was another reason why I've always felt that the Walton story is a great bookend for this, because Walton is a similarly obsessed character to Victor, whereas Victor was obsessed and fixated on reanimating dead tissue. Walton was obsessed and fixated on breaking through the ice and making it to the North Pole. So seeing how Victor's obsession destroyed him acts as a wake-up call for Walton, where he realizes, I'm heading down a very similar path here, and this can only end in misery. So, yep, let's go home, boys. We gave it a good shot. Meanwhile, the monster has tracked Victor back to the ship, and when Walton returns to his quarters, he finds the monster there over the body of Victor. Of course, he immediately realizes who this is, and he explains to the monster that Victor is dead. He's passed away. And there's a wonderful scene where the monster and Walton have a very civilized conversation. Of course, Walton knows the whole story now. It's almost like the monster gives Walton his final confession and tells him, "Do you think I felt joy when William died in my arms? Or when I felt the life drain out of Elizabeth when I strangled her?" It's like, no, I was miserable. I was alone. I had been condemned to this by this man, and vengeance was all I had left. So they have a very, civilized conversation. There's a lot of moral questions that are raised, of course, by the monster's actions and so forth, but he says his piece. He picks up Victor's body and walks off into the Arctic wilderness, never to be seen again. So, wow. What a fantastic adaptation. I cannot recommend this highly enough. And big thanks to those of you who recommended it to me. I really enjoyed this a lot. I watched it last year and was just completely enraptured by it. And again this year, I was again completely enraptured. We actually did a group viewing of this, and a bunch of us watched it and had a great time. And there you have it. So yeah, if you're looking for an adaptation that adheres a little more closely to the original story, I highly recommend this 2004 miniseries version. It's really, really good stuff. Very well done, and I will definitely be coming back to it again and again. And big thanks once again to those of you fine viewers who recommended it to me in the first place. I really appreciate the recommendation. Alrighty, well that is it from me to you for now, so until next time, thanks for watching. Big thanks to my Patreon sponsors, and sayonara. Audio is recording, video is recording. That means I am now committed to produce a video. Once they start, they cannot be stopped until a video has been made. Thanks for watching. Big thanks to my Patreon sponsors. And, sayonara. Ow. Try not to knock everything over this time. Okay. And there you have it. So, definitely worth checking out if you're looking for looking. He finishes assembling the body, and then gets really drunk. So yeah, definitely worth checking out if you're looking for something that adheres a lot more closely to the story of the book. And yeah. He grabs a trench coat off of the fucking chair. And there you have it. So yeah, definitely worth checking out if you're looking for an adaptation that adheres a little more closely to the original story of the book. Yeah, I really enjoyed this one a lot. And once again, thank you to all of you viewers who recommended it to me. It's definitely one that I'll be coming back to again and again. I thought it was terrific. Alrighty, that is it for me to you for now, so until next time, fuck you! That's alright. I didn't like how I kept rambling in that. I gotta tighten it up a little bit.